Why wasn't she panicking? That's the question everyone should have asked. But in a room full of chaos, a room where digital fire was consuming everything they'd built, no one thought to look at the woman who stood perfectly still. Commander Eva Rostova, small, forgettable, silent. While screens blazed red and voices cracked with fear, she simply watched, head tilted, listening to something no one else could hear. The air in the Global Command Operations Center hummed with a frequency that lived in your bones. Cold, sterile. A place designed to strip away everything human, everything messy. Just you, the machines, and the mission. On the massive holographic display that dominated the room, friendly naval assets blinked in anxious blue, but they were being hunted. Red icons swarmed across the network like a virus that had learned to think. Not brute force, something worse. A parasitic code that spoke their own language, mimicked their handshakes, slipped through every defense like smoke through fingers. They were being beaten by a ghost. Rear Admiral Marcus Thorne paced the command deck like a caged animal. His face was crimson. Fury radiated off him in waves. This was his project, his baby, the Aegis Next Generation Network. A system he'd personally bulldozed through procurement past every objection, every cautionary report. He'd staked his career on it, his legacy, and now it was collapsing in real time in front of everyone. Get it back. His voice was a theatrical roar, the kind that filled congressional hearing rooms and made junior officers flinch. Get it back now. But no one could. The technicians hunched over their keyboards, faces painted blue by scrolling code, were drowning. Task Force Sierra had gone dark. Billions of dollars in naval assets blind. No comms, no data, just silence in the vast cold ocean. And in that silence, vulnerabilities, threats they couldn't see coming. Thorne needed a target, someone to blame, someone to break. His eyes swept the room and landed on her. Commander Eva Rostova stood by the C4I status board. Command, control, communications, computers, and intelligence. The nervous system of modern warfare. She wasn't typing, wasn't shouting orders. She was just there, motionless in the storm, watching the waterfall of corrupted data with an expression that could have been carved from stone. To Thorne, her silence looked like insubordination, like judgment. His voice was a physical blow. He jabbed a finger at her, closing the distance with heavy, furious steps. Commander Rostova, you're the senior signals intelligence officer on this watch. This is your failure. Around them, operators tried to make themselves smaller. The confrontation was magnetic, terrible to watch but impossible to look away from. Thorne was built for peacetime parades and photo ops. His uniform always crisp, his voice always confident. He was a man who'd never seen real combat but spoke about war like he owned it. Now that certainty was cracking apart, and he needed someone to carry the weight of it. Your department guaranteed me this network was impenetrable. Rostova's gaze shifted from the board to him. Her eyes were calm, neutral gray, the kind of calm that comes from knowing something others don't. Admiral, the report I filed on May 14th detailed this exact vulnerability. The polymorphic signature was a theoretical probability. We requested a full diagnostic quarantine. The request was denied. Her voice was low, without inflection, a simple statement of fact. The mention of her report, a report he had personally dismissed as alarmist paranoia, sent fresh fire through Thorne's veins. It was one thing to fail. It was another to be reminded of it so clinically, so publicly, by someone who tried to warn him. He came down from the command dais, his polished shoes clicking sharply on the composite deck. Operators flinched as he passed, their focus broken, their fear palpable. A theoretical probability, he sneered, getting close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. This is not theoretical, Commander. We are blind. We have lost contact with Task Force Sierra. That is on you. You were supposed to have a contingency. The contingency was the quarantine, Admiral, her voice unwavering. Protocol requires. Protocol? he was shouting now, his face inches from hers. "I am the Admiral here, I am the protocol. You people and your binders and your endless cowardly procedures. You know what you are, Commander. You're a tick-box officer. You file your reports so you can cover your backside when the real world happens. You have no instinct, no fight." He was losing control, and some part of him knew it. But the fury was a runaway train. He needed to make her break, needed to see fear or tears or anything other than this placid, infuriating calm. "You're pissing me off," he bellowed, the words echoing in the sudden, horrified silence of the ops center. His hand shot out. He didn't mean to, not really. But the impulse was faster than judgment. He didn't strike her. He grabbed the fabric of her uniform sleeve, the crisp navy blue of her working jacket. He yanked, intending to physically shake her to force a reaction. The sound of tearing fabric was shockingly loud in the quiet room. A long, ragged rip appeared, shearing the material from her shoulder down toward her elbow. The sleeve gaped open. And then everyone, including Admiral Thorne, froze. There on the pale, exposed skin of her upper arm was a tattoo. It wasn't the usual sailor's anchor or sentimental script. It was a stark black emblem, a phoenix, its wings spread wide, rising from a bed of stylized flames. But it wasn't just any phoenix. Its head was tilted, its eye a piercing dot of black, and clutched in its talons was not a branch but a shattered radio antenna. Below it, in severe blocky script, were two words, Fides and Tenebris, faith in the antennas. Thorne stared. His hand, still holding a piece of torn cloth, fell slack. The emblem was unfamiliar, yet it radiated a kind of lethal authority. It was not a design one found in a dockside tattoo parlor. It was a symbol, precise, deliberate, military. The room, already quiet, seemed to have the very air sucked out of it. The operators weren't looking at the failing network anymore. They were looking at the tattoo, at her, seeing something they hadn't seen before. Commander Rostova did not flinch, did not gasp, did not even look at her torn sleeve. Her calm gray eyes remained fixed on Admiral Thorne's face. She watched the crimson rage drain away, replaced by a wave of confusion, then a flicker of something he hadn't felt in decades: uncertainty. She held his gaze for a long, silent moment. Then, with slow, deliberate motion, she reached up and gently pulled the tattered edges of her sleeve together, hiding the emblem from view. She did not address his violence, did not acknowledge the torn fabric hanging from her arm. "Lieutenant Calloway," she said, her voice cutting cleanly through the thick silence. Her gaze shifted to a young officer hunched over a console. "Please log 1 Type 4 uniform jacket, service issue, as damaged during active operations. Time index the event to primary security camera feed, angle 47. Lieutenant Calloway, a gangly officer who always seemed overwhelmed, looked from Rostova to the Admiral, his mouth slightly agape. He nodded numbly, his fingers fumbling on his keyboard. Rostova then turned her attention back to the Admiral. She gave a short, correct nod, a gesture of procedural acknowledgement, not deference. "With your permission, Admiral, I will now withdraw and prepare a full after-action report on the network failure." She didn't wait for permission. She turned and walked, not hurried, not angry, just gone. Her footsteps were nearly silent as she exited the operations center, leaving behind a room full of stunned witnesses, a torn piece of fabric on the floor, and an Admiral who was suddenly, terrifyingly aware that he had just ripped the curtain aside on something he did not understand at all. The red icons on the holographic map continued their silent, inexorable advance. What happens when you tear away someone's disguise and find something you were never meant to see? Back in her quarters, the silence was a welcome pressure. The space was Spartan, clinical. A single bunk, a small desk, a locked footlocker. There were no personal photos, no souvenirs. Her life was contained in regulations and encrypted hardware. She laid the damaged jacket on her bunk, the tear a jagged wound in the dark blue fabric. For a moment she traced its edge with a single finger, her touch light, analytical. She didn't curse the Admiral, didn't dwell on the humiliation. Emotion was a variable, and her work was about eliminating variables. The incident was now a data point. She sat at her desk and powered on a hardened laptop, its case scarred and utilitarian. It bypassed the ship's main network, connecting to a secure closed-loop server via hardline port. She opened a new file, the cursor blinking in the void. Her report was lean, clinical. Incident report October 22, 1437 Zulu. Location Global Command Operations Center. Subject Network Compromise and Command Confrontation. She detailed the timeline of the attack, the polymorphic code signature, the cascade failure of the Aegis system. Then, with the same dispassionate precision, she documented the confrontation. Admiral Thorne's verbal assault, the physical contact, the torn uniform. She attached the camera angle she'd referenced. Angle 47 captured everything. The grab, the rip, the tattoo. She didn't editorialize, didn't say he was wrong or cruel. She just wrote what happened. The facts, let them speak. She encrypted the file and sent it through secure channels, not to her immediate chain of command. That chain included Thorne. She sent it higher, much higher, to the Office of Naval Intelligence, to people who would understand what that tattoo meant. Then she closed the laptop, stripped off the damaged jacket, and changed into a fresh uniform. She folded the torn one with care, placed it in a clear evidence bag, and sealed it. Everything documented, everything preserved. She lay on her bunk, staring at the ceiling. The hum of the ship systems was a familiar lullaby. She thought about the network failure, about the code she'd seen, about the vulnerability she'd warned them about months ago. She'd been right, but being right didn't matter if no one listened. That was the hardest part of her job, not the analysis, not the long hours staring at data streams. It was the waiting, the hopping that someone somewhere would read her reports before it was too late. Sometimes they did, often they didn't. She closed her eyes, sleep came easily. She'd done her job, the rest was out of her hands. While she slept, the machinery of consequence began to turn. The report landed on the desk of Captain James Evans, the ship's commanding officer, at 200 hours. He read it twice. His face went pale, then red, then pale again. He immediately woke his legal officer and the master chief of the command. They gathered in his cabin, the report displayed on his private terminal, and they read it in silence. "Jesus Christ," the legal officer whispered. Master Chief Torres leaned closer to the screen, squinting at the image of the tattoo. His eyes widened. "Oh no, oh Admiral, what did you do?" "What?" Captain Evans looked between them. "What am I missing here?" Torres sat back heavily. "Sir, do you know what that emblem is?" "Number should I?" "Most people shouldn't, that's the point." Torres rubbed his face. "Captain, we need to make some calls, right now. This just became a matter for ONI." By dawn, 3 men in civilian clothes arrived via helicopter. They carried no identification, no visible rank. They spoke to no one except Captain Evans. They confiscated the torn jacket. They downloaded the security footage. They interviewed Lieutenant Calloway and 2 other witnesses. They did not interview Commander Rostova. They didn't need to. They already knew everything about her. Admiral Thorne was summoned to the captain's cabin at 800 hours. He entered expecting a private discussion, maybe a quiet reprimand. Instead, he found himself facing Captain Evans, the legal officer, Master Chief Torres, and the 3 civilians. The atmosphere was cold, formal. "Admiral Thorne," one of the civilians began, his voice flat and bureaucratic, "we need to discuss an incident that occurred yesterday in the operations center." Thorne's jaw tightened. "If this is about my exchange with Commander Rostova, I'll address it through appropriate channels." "Sir," the civilian continued, ignoring the deflection, "did you physically grab Commander Rostova's uniform?" "I may have made contact, yes, in the heat of the moment, but—" "And in doing so, you tore her jacket sleeve, exposing a tattoo on her upper arm." "Yes, what of it? Do you know what that tattoo represents?" Thorne hesitated. Number should I? The civilian opened a folder and slid a photograph across the table. It was a close-up of the Phoenix emblem. Clear, detailed, undeniable. This is the insignia of Project Trident. Thorne stared at the photo. I've never heard of it. Most people haven't. That's intentional. What had he stumbled into? What door had he kicked open? Master Chief Torres cleared his throat. He was an old sailor, a man who'd seen 30 years of naval service, who'd sailed with legends and ghosts. When he spoke, it was with the weight of institutional memory. Admiral, permission to speak freely. Thorne nodded, though he looked like a man who didn't want to hear what came next. Project Trident, Torres began, his voice low and measured, was established in the late 90s during the Gulf War aftermath. Our networks were getting hammered by adversaries we couldn't even identify. We were blind, deaf, vulnerable. The Pentagon realized we had a critical problem. Our cyber warfare and signals intelligence capabilities were 20 years behind the threats we were facing. So they created something radical, something outside the normal chain. He paused, letting the words settle. Project Trident wasn't about building better hardware, sir. It was about finding better minds. They recruited a handful of people, prodigies mostly, from inside and outside the service. Mathematicians, hackers, linguists, signal analysts, people who didn't think like soldiers but like the enemy. They didn't have a traditional base. They didn't have a standard uniform. They were a ghost unit. They'd be inserted, digitally or physically, into our worst C4I problems. They'd break our own systems, find the flaws, rebuild them from the inside out, stronger than before. Thorne was staring at the tattoo now, his face ashen. Their training was legendary, Torres continued. It was said they could crash a carrier group's entire network with a satellite phone and a laptop, then restore it before the coffee got cold. Their operational name was Phoenix Team. The room was dead silent. The Phoenix, Torres said, pointing to the photo, because they brought systems back from the dead. The broken antenna because they believe the only secure system is one you've already broken yourself. Fids antennabris, faith in the antennas. It was a twist on the old Special Forces motto about faith in the dark. They had faith in the very signals, the very spectrum, that others saw as chaos. One of the civilians took over. The program was officially disbanded in 2010, or at least that's the public record. The truth is, Project Trident was too valuable to let go. Its members were sheep-dipped, given clean, sterile service records and reintegrated back into the regular forces. They were placed in key positions, their past sealed at the highest levels of naval intelligence. He leaned forward. They serve as a quiet internal immune system, Admiral. They watch, they listen. They identify threats long before men like you see them on a big screen. They file reports, and they hope someone is wise enough to read them. The revelation hung in the air, thick and undeniable. Thorne felt the floor dropping out from under him. The quiet procedural officer, the tick-box commander, she hadn't been paralyzed. She'd been assessing. She hadn't been weak. She'd been waiting, watching the system collapse exactly as she'd predicted it would. Her calm wasn't ignorance. It was the practiced discipline of a specialist who saw the entire problem from beginning to end while everyone else was reacting to the explosion. Her report wasn't a cover-your-backside memo. It was a ghost's warning. And he dismissed it, mocked her, grabbed her, torn away the one thing she'd spent years protecting. Her cover. The civilian closed the folder. You didn't just rip a commander's sleeve, Admiral Thorne. You tore the cover off one of the Navy's most carefully guarded secrets. And you did it because you mistook a lifetime of elite, silent competence for weakness. You saw a ghost, sir, and you thought she was just a shadow. Captain Evans spoke for the first time. His voice was quiet but final. Admiral, a formal investigation is being opened. You're relieved of operational command pending the outcome. Master Chief Torres will escort you to temporary quarters. Thorne opened his mouth to protest, but no words came. He looked around the room, searching for an ally, for someone who might defend him. He found only stone faces and cold judgment. He'd been undone by silence, by a woman who never raised her voice, never fought back, never needed to. Because the system, the institution, the machinery he thought he controlled had been watching the whole time. And it had chosen her. How do you restore something that's been shattered in front of everyone? A week later, the entire ship's company was assembled on the flight deck. The sea was a calm gray sheet under a matching sky. The air was cool, carrying the scent of salt and jet fuel. It was a formal ceremony, but it felt more like a tribunal. The fleet commander himself, a four-star admiral flown in for the occasion, stood at the podium. His remarks were brief, surgically precise, devoid of any attempt to soften the blow. He spoke of accountability, of the difference between authority and leadership, of the critical importance of heeding expert counsel, regardless of rank. He did not name Admiral Thorne, but he didn't have to. Thorne stood off to the side, his uniform immaculate, his face a gray, stony mask. He'd been formally censured and was being relieved of his command. His career was over, not with a bang, but with this quiet, public dismantling. Then the fleet commander turned to Commander Rostova, who stood before him, poised, calm. The wind pulled at her uniform, but she stood like she was rooted to the deck. "Commander Rostova," he said, his voice resonating across the flight deck, carrying to every sailor assembled there. "On behalf of the United States Navy, I offer a formal and public apology. An error in leadership was made. You, however, acted in accordance with the highest traditions of the naval service, with foresight, discipline, and profound competence. The system failed you. You did not fail the system." A murmur rippled through the assembled crew. This was unprecedented. Admirals didn't apologize. Institutions didn't admit fault. But here it was in front of everyone. The fleet commander gestured to an aide, who brought forward a small velvet-covered box. Inside was not a medal, but a new commander's jacket. The fabric a deep, perfect navy blue. "A debt is owed," the fleet commander continued. "It will be paid in part by a restoration of respect." He then looked directly at Marcus Thorne. "Admiral Thorne, you will do the honors." A collective intake of breath rippled through the crew. Thorne flinched, a barely perceptible tremor. This was the true punishment, a ritual of humiliation far more potent than any entry in his service record. For a long moment he stood frozen, his face a battlefield of emotions: rage, shame, defeat. Then with stiff, jerky movements like a man being forced, he walked to the aide, took the jacket, and approached Rostova. He stopped before her, the jacket held out in his hands. He could not meet her eyes. He looked at her collar, at the floor. Anywhere but her calm, gray gaze, the silence stretched, heavy, suffocating. The entire crew watched, waiting. Slowly, deliberately, Thorne raised his right hand. It was a shaky, almost reluctant movement. He rendered a salute. It was the salute of a defeated man, an offering of respect from someone who had given only contempt. Commander Eva Rostova, her expression unchanged, returned the salute. Her motion was crisp, clean, perfect. It was not triumphant, it was not mocking, it was procedural, it was correct. She lowered her hand and Thorne offered her the jacket. She took it without a word, without acknowledgement. The exchange was complete, a silent apology, a public restoration of order. Captain Evans, standing with his officers, watched with grim satisfaction. Master Chief Torres, observing from the edge of the crowd, gave a slow, single nod. The recognition was complete. The institution, wounded by the arrogance of one, had been recalibrated by the quiet competence of another. And Commander Rostova stood there, holding her new jacket, her face betraying nothing. Not relief, not vindication, just the same calm she'd worn through everything. The same stillness that had started this all. Because dignity doesn't need to speak, it simply acts. Could things ever go back to normal after everyone had seen the truth? The hum of the operations center was a familiar comfort. The red strobes of alert had been replaced by the steady, cool blue of normal status. The holographic map showed no threats, only the orderly procession of friendly assets moving through their designated sea lanes. The room was quieter than it had been before the incident. The usual bravado and loud talk were gone, replaced by a low, focused murmur. People moved with more deliberation, their voices softer. They gave Commander Rostova a wide berth, not out of fear, but out of a new, profound, and slightly awed respect. She wasn't just another officer anymore. She was something else, something they couldn't quite name but instinctively recognized. She stood at her station, monitoring the flow of global signals data. The universe of information was calm, patterns within patterns, the digital heartbeat of the Navy's nervous system steady and strong. She'd rebuilt parts of it herself in the days following the attack. Quietly, efficiently, no fanfare, just work. Lieutenant Calloway approached her, his nervousness now replaced by quiet reverence. "Commander," he began, his voice hesitant, "I just wanted to say about what the Admiral did. I'm sorry you went through that." Rostova's eyes did not leave the screen. She tracked a particularly clean satellite handoff, her mind already on the next orbital pass, the next potential anomaly. "The system is self-correcting, Lieutenant," she said, her voice low and even. She wasn't dismissing him, she was teaching him. The apology was unnecessary. The outcome was what mattered. The personal insult was noise. The institutional repair was the signal. He understood. He nodded, a new comprehension dawning in his eyes. "Yes, Commander." He returned to his post, a better officer than he'd been a week ago. Better because he'd seen what real competence looked like. Not the loud kind, not the showy kind, the quiet kind. The kind that works in shadows and files reports no one reads until it's too late. The kind that doesn't need credit because the work itself is the reward. Rostova watched the data stream for another moment, ensuring all systems were optimal, all patterns stable. The network was healthier than it had ever been. The culture of the command was, too. People asked questions now, read reports, listened to warnings. The arrogance had been burned away. What remained was sharper, cleaner. She opened a small, encrypted log file on her private console, the same one where she'd filed her report on the Admiral. The cursor blinked. She typed a single final entry for the event. "Correction achieved." 3 words, that's all it needed. The incident was closed in her mind, archived, filed away with all the other data points of her career. She wasn't angry, wasn't bitter. Thorn had been a problem and the problem had been solved. The system had done its job, eventually. She closed the file and returned her attention to the screens. A new signal pattern was emerging in the North Atlantic. Faint, irregular, probably nothing. But she'd learned long ago that probably nothing was where the real threats hid. She flagged it, started a trace, began building a profile. Hours passed. The watch changed. New operators filtered in, replacing tired ones. The coffee pot emptied and refilled. The world turned, and Commander Eva Rostova remained at her station, watching the data, listening to the signals, doing what she'd always done. Her job. Later that night, back in her quarters, she finally took off the new jacket. The fabric was perfect, unworn. It smelled faintly of fresh dye and storage. She hung it carefully in her locker beside her other uniforms, identical, interchangeable. The torn one had been catalogued as evidence and then destroyed, as it should be. No souvenirs, no reminders. She sat on her bunk and pulled out a small, battered notebook. Not digital, old school, paper and pen. She opened it to a blank page and wrote the date. Then, in neat, precise handwriting, she wrote a single line. "Sometimes the storm reveals what was always there." It wasn't poetry, it wasn't profound, it was just an observation, a lesson learned or perhaps relearned. She'd spent years hiding in plain sight, being dismissed, being underestimated, being invisible, and she'd been fine with that. It was part of the job, part of the mission. But now the mask was off. People knew, Not everything, but enough. And the question was, could she still do her job? Could a ghost operate in daylight? She thought about it for a long moment, pen hovering over the page. Then she wrote one more line. Yes, because they're still not looking at the right things. She closed the notebook, smiled faintly. The truth was, most people had seen the tattoo and thought they understood. They thought she was special forces, a cyber warrior, elite. And sure, that was true, but they'd missed the deeper point. The tattoo wasn't about her. It was about the work. About the belief that systems could be healed, that networks could be resurrected, that even in chaos there was signal if you knew how to listen. Fides and tenebris, faith in the antennas. It meant trusting the signal even when the noise was overwhelming. It meant believing in the data even when everyone else was panicking. It meant doing your job, filing your reports, raising your warnings, and having faith that eventually someone would listen. Not because you needed validation, but because the mission mattered more than your pride. She lay back on her bunk, hands behind her head, staring at the ceiling. The ship's systems hummed their lullaby. Somewhere above her, sailors were standing watch. Somewhere below, engineers were maintaining engines. Somewhere in the ocean, ships moved through the dark, trusting that somewhere, someone like her was watching the network, guarding the signals, keeping them safe. It was a big responsibility, a heavy one, but she'd carried it for years, and she'd carry it for years more. Because that's what ghosts did. They watched, they waited, they warned. And when no one listened, they documented everything and kept working. Because eventually the truth had a way of surfacing. Eventually, the signal cut through the noise. Sometimes it took a torn sleeve and a public reckoning. Sometimes it took a four-star admiral and a formal apology, but it happened. The system corrected itself, not quickly, not easily, but inevitably. She closed her eyes. Sleep came easily again because she'd done her job, she'd been right, she'd been heard. And tomorrow she'd wake up and do it all over again. Watch the screens, track the patterns, file the reports, trust the signal. Quiet competence didn't need applause. It didn't need medals or ceremonies or public vindication. It just needed the mission and the faith that the work mattered. Even if no one was watching. Especially if no one was watching. Because in the end, dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. It files the report. It keeps the watch. It stands at the station while the world falls apart and waits, patient and still, for the system to remember why it built people like her in the first place. Not to be heroes, not to be celebrated, but to be the quiet immune system. The warning no one wants to hear until it's too late. The ghost in the machine who knows the code, who sees the vulnerability, who raises the alarm and then goes back to work when no one listens. Until the day they do, and the system corrects itself, and order is restored, and the mission continues. Always the mission, always the signal, always the faith that somewhere in the noise there was truth worth protecting. That was her job. That was her calling. That was the meaning behind the phoenix on her arm, rising from flames, holding a broken antenna, reminding anyone who saw it that strength isn't always loud, competence isn't always celebrated, and the most dangerous people in any room are often the ones no one's paying attention to. Until it's too late, until the sleeve is torn, until the ghost steps into the light and everyone realizes they should have been listening all along. Commander Eva Rostova understood this, had always understood it, and she'd keep understanding it long after this incident faded into naval legend, long after Admiral Thorne became a cautionary tale, long after the ceremony was forgotten and the apology was archived. Because some truths were eternal, some lessons had to be learned the hard way, and some people carried the weight of knowledge so quietly that when the world finally noticed them, it was already too late to pretend they were ever ordinary. She was a phoenix, she was a ghost, she was the signal in the noise. And she was exactly where she needed to be.